The gavel hadn't yet fallen when Rex began to growl. It started as a low rumble deep in the German Shepherd's chest, barely audible over the murmur of voices in the packed courtroom. Detective Marcus Rivera felt the vibration through the metal floor beneath his shackled feet, and his weathered hands instinctively reached toward his partner of 8 years, only to be jerked back by the cold bite of handcuffs. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from months of sleepless nights in a cell that reeked of disinfectant and despair. Easy. But Rex wasn't easy. The 100-pound shepherd's hackles rose like a storm cloud gathering strength, his amber eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the jury, not even on the prosecutor who had spent 3 weeks painting Marcus as a corrupt cop who'd stolen evidence and betrayed his badge. Rex's unwavering gaze was locked on someone in the gallery. Someone who had been sitting quietly in the third row, wearing a perfectly pressed suit and an expression of practiced sympathy. The courtroom fell silent except for the low, continuous growl that seemed to echo off the oak paneling and marble columns. Judge Catherine Holloway paused mid-sentence, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she peered over the bench. The 12 jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her stenotype machine. "Officer Rivera," Judge Holloway said sharply, "control your animal." Marcus tried to lean forward, but the chains connecting his ankle shackles to his waist restraints bit into his flesh. "Rex down," he commanded, but his voice cracked. 8 years of partnership, 8 years of trust so complete they could communicate with a glance, and now he couldn't even touch his partner to offer comfort. The growl intensified. "Your Honor," Marcus's court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, stood nervously. "Perhaps we could have the dog removed from the courtroom, though." The word came out harder than Marcus intended, echoing off the walls like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him, but he kept his eyes on Rex. He stays. The German Shepherd's tail had gone rigid, his entire body coiled like a spring. Marcus had seen this stance before in dark alleys where danger lurked, in buildings where bombs might be hidden, in moments when Rex's nose and instincts detected threats that human senses couldn't perceive. But this was a courtroom. What could possibly? Rex's growl cut off abruptly, replaced by something Marcus had never heard from his partner in 8 years of service. A whimper, not the whimper of fear or pain, but something deeper, more primal, a sound that spoke of recognition, of betrayal, of a truth so profound it couldn't be contained by canine vocal cords. The man in the third row, Deputy Chief William Hawthorne, Marcus's former supervisor and the officer who had first reported the missing evidence, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A bead of sweat traced down his temple despite the courtroom's air conditioning. "Rex," Marcus whispered again, and this time his voice carried 8 years of shared dangers, 8 years of watching each other's backs, 8 years of a bond that transcended the gap between human and animal. "What is it, boy? What do you smell?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and expectant. Rex turned his magnificent head toward Marcus, and in those amber eyes, Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Knowledge, certainty, and beneath it all, a desperate need to communicate something that could change everything. Judge Holloway was speaking again, something about maintaining order in her courtroom, but Marcus couldn't hear her words over the thundering of his own heartbeat, because Rex was doing something he'd never done before in all their years together. He was backing away from Deputy Chief Hawthorne. Rex had never backed away from anything in his life. 3 years earlier, the warehouse district of East Cleveland looked like a war zone at 2:47 a.m., all broken glass and shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Marcus Rivera crouched behind a rusted dumpster, his service weapon drawn, waiting for backup that was still 6 minutes out. The tip had come in anonymous. Major drug operation. Heavily armed suspects, enough fentanyl to kill half the city. He should have waited. Protocol demanded it, but somewhere in that maze of abandoned buildings, a 13-year-old girl named Maria Santos was being held by dealers who'd already killed twice that month. Protocol was a luxury Maria couldn't afford. Dispatch. This is Rivera. Going in. Negative. Rivera, wait for backup. Marcus switched off his radio and looked down at the German Shepherd beside him. Rex had been his partner for 5 years then, a Kevlar-vested force of nature with a nose that could detect drugs through concrete, and a loyalty that ran deeper than blood. They'd been through Iraq together, Marcus as a Marine MP, Rex as an explosives detection dog. They'd survived IEDs, sniper fire, and the kind of heat that turned vehicles into ovens. A warehouse full of drug dealers should have been just another Tuesday. "You ready for this, boy?" Rex's tail wagged once, not the happy wag of a pet, but the controlled motion of a warrior acknowledging his orders. They moved through the shadows like ghosts, Rex's nose leading them past tripwires, around motion sensors, through a maze of booby traps that would have killed any human who'd tried to navigate it alone. The warehouse loomed ahead, 3 stories of broken windows and rusted fire escapes. Intel suggested Maria was being held on the 2nd floor, but intel had been wrong before. Rex stopped at the building's entrance, his nose working the air like a sommelier tasting vintage wine. Then he looked up at Marcus and gave the signal. A single paw, raised ears forward. Drugs, lots of them, but underneath the chemical signature of narcotics, something else. Fear. Young Fear. They found the girl in a room that had once been an office, now stripped to bare walls and a single mattress. Maria Santos, 13 years old, heroin needle tracks on her arms, eyes wide with terror and withdrawal. 3 dealers guarded her, their attention focused on a poker game and a bottle of cheap bourbon. Marcus had planned to wait, to observe, to call in the cavalry, but Maria chose that moment to whimper, a sound so broken it bypassed his training and went straight to his heart. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. When it was over, 2 dealers were dead, 1 was wounded, and Marcus had taken a bullet in the shoulder that would leave him with a permanent reminder of the night. He chose a little girl's life over procedure, but it was what happened next that forged the unbreakable bond between man and dog. That as Marcus knelt beside Maria, trying to keep pressure on his wound while whispering words of comfort to a girl who'd seen too much, Rex did something he'd never done before. The German Shepherd, trained to detect explosives and drugs, trained to attack on command and defend his handler, gently placed his massive head on Maria's lap and began to whimper, not from pain or fear, but from empathy. The girl's shaking hands found Rex's fur, and for the first time in 3 weeks of captivity, she smiled. "It's okay, baby," Marcus told her, his own voice shaking. "You're safe now. We're going to take you home." Rex stayed with Maria until the EMTs arrived, never moving from her side, his amber eyes never leaving her face. Later, at the hospital, when the doctors were stitching up Marcus's shoulder, a nurse told him that the girl had asked for the angel dog. Rex had become her anchor in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. That night, Marcus understood something about his partner that he'd never fully grasped before. Rex wasn't just a tool, wasn't just a highly trained animal. He was a soulless spirit capable of recognizing innocence and evil, of understanding justice and injustice, of seeing truth in a world full of lies. Deputy Chief William Hawthorne had but been the first to congratulate Marcus when he returned to duty. "Hell of a thing you did, Rivera, hell of a thing. That dog of yours is something special." Marcus had nodded, accepting the praise, accepting the commendation that would later hang on his wall, but he'd never forgotten the look in Hawthorne's eyes that day, something that didn't quite match his words, something that made Rex's ears flatten against his head whenever the deputy chief was around. Present day. Now, sitting in shackles in a courtroom that felt more like a tomb, Marcus remembered that look, remembered the way Rex had always tensed when Hawthorne approached, remembered how his partner's tail had never wagged for the man who had become his biggest supporter, his strongest advocate, his his accuser. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Rex's whimper grew louder, more insistent. The German Shepherd had moved as far from Deputy Chief Hawthorne as his position would allow, his body language screaming alarm to anyone who understood the subtle communication between working dogs and their handlers. "Your Honor, Prosecutor," Janet Morrison stood, her voice cutting through the murmur like a blade. "This is highly irregular. The defendant's animal is clearly distressed in disrupting these proceedings." Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses, studying the scene with the patience of someone who'd seen everything in 30 years on the bench. "Mr. Rivera, can you explain your dog's behavior?" Marcus's throat felt like sandpaper. How could he explain that Rex had never acted like this before, that in 8 years of partnership, through drug raids and bomb threats, through the chaos of natural disasters and the hell of war zones, his partner had never shown fear or uncertainty? He's trying to tell us something, Your Honor." A ripple of laughter ran through the gallery, not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes when people are uncomfortable and looking for release. Only one person wasn't laughing. Deputy Chief Hawthorne sat rigid in his seat, his hands gripping the pew in front of him so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Dogs don't testify in my courtroom, Mr. Rivera," Judge Holloway said firmly. "Officer Chen, please have the bailiff remove the animal." "No," Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. "Please, Your Honor, he's all I have left." The words hung in the air, naked and desperate. Sarah Chen, his attorney, was on her feet again, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Your Honor, my client is under tremendous stress. Perhaps we could take a short recess." But before Judge Holloway could respond, something extraordinary happened. Rex, who had been backing away from Hawthorne, suddenly froze. His head snapped toward the gallery, his nose working the air with the intensity of a radar dish tracking. A signal then, with a grace that belied his size, the German Shepherd began to move, not toward the exit, not toward Marcus, toward the woman sitting in the front row, clutching a tissue and dabbing at her eyes. Margaret Hawthorne, the deputy chief's wife. Rex approached her slowly, his massive head lowered, his amber eyes never leaving her face. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time the quiet was different, charged with possibility, electric with the sense that something important was about to happen. Margaret Hawthorne stared at the approaching dog, her face pale as winter. "Snow William," she whispered to her husband, her voice barely audible. "William, make it stop." But Rex didn't stop. He sat directly in front of her, his head tilted in the universal canine gesture of curiosity. And then he did something that made every person in that courtroom hold their breath. He placed his right paw on her knee. It was a gentle gesture, almost tender, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Margaret Hawthorne's composure crumbled like a house of cards in a tornado. Tears streamed down her face as she stared into Rex's eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said to the dog. "I'm so sorry, Maggie." Deputy Chief Hawthorne's voice was sharp with warning. "Don't say another word." But Margaret wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at Rex, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended species, a recognition of guilt and innocence, of truth and lies, of the weight that comes from carrying secrets that eat away at the soul. "He knows," she whispered. "God help me, he knows." Prosecutor Morrison was on her feet, objecting to something, but Marcus couldn't hear her words over the roaring in his ears, because Rex was doing his job, not the job he'd been trained for, not the job he'd been paid for, but the job he'd been born for. He was finding the truth. Bailiff Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of courtroom drama, approached Rex cautiously. "Come on, boy, time to go." Rex turned to look at him, and Rodriguez later told his wife that he'd never seen anything like it. Intelligence so pure and focused it was almost human. The dog's gaze moved from Rodriguez to Marcus, then back to Margaret Hawthorne, as if he were trying to draw connections, to make people understand something vital. "He's not going to hurt anyone," Marcus said, his voice steady for the first time that day. "He's just doing his job." "His job is to detect drugs and explosives," Morrison snapped, "not to terrorize witnesses." "His job," Marcus replied, meeting her eyes across the courtroom, "is to find the truth." Rex's tail wagged once, a single, controlled movement that every dog handler in the room recognized as acknowledgement. The German Shepherd stood, turned away from Margaret Hawthorne, and walked back to Marcus's side. But his eyes never left Deputy Chief Hawthorne's face. And for the first time since the trial began, Marcus Rivera smiled. 18 months earlier, The evidence locker in the basement of the 5th Precinct was a fortress of steel and concrete, protected by electronic locks, security cameras, and a sign-in system that tracked every person who entered. It was there, in the climate-controlled depths beneath the chaos of the squad room, that the seeds of Marcus Rivera's destruction had been planted. Case number 202-34419, the West Side murders. 3 bodies, all young women, all found with trace amounts of a rare synthetic drug called Blue Angel in their systems. The drug was new, experimental, and according to the DEA, it didn't officially exist. But someone was manufacturing it, someone was distributing it, and someone was using it to kill. Marcus had been lead detective on the case, with Rex as his partner. They'd worked 18-hour days, following leads that evaporated like morning mist, chasing shadows through the city's underbelly. The breakthrough came when Rex eluded on a warehouse in the industrial district. The same nose that had saved Marcus's life a dozen times over detected something the human investigators had missed. Inside, they found a laboratory that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Gleaming equipment, chemical formulas scrolled on whiteboards, and enough Blue Angel to kill thousands. But more importantly, they found evidence, financial records, phone numbers, a trail of breadcrumbs that led back to someone with access to police evidence. Someone who'd been selling confiscated drugs to underground chemists. Someone on the inside. Hell of a collar, Rivera, Deputy Chief Hawthorne had said when Marcus delivered the evidence. "This'll shut down the whole operation." Marcus had nodded, but something in Hawthorne's voice made Rex's ears flatten. The German Shepherd had never liked the deputy chief, had always maintained a wary distance whenever the man approached. Marcus had attributed it to Rex's protective instincts. Some dogs just didn't warm up to authority figures. He'd been wrong. The evidence from the warehouse had been catalogued, stored, and secured according to protocol. Marcus had personally delivered it to the evidence locker, had watched as Detective Sally Morrison, the prosecutor's sister and the department's evidence custodian, logged every item into the system. Chain of custody was unbroken, documentation was perfect, and the case against the Blue Angel manufacturers was airtight until it wasn't. 3 weeks later, when the prosecution was preparing for trial, Sally Morrison had made a discovery that would change everything. Half the evidence was missing. The financial records that would have exposed the police connection gone. The phone logs that would have revealed the inside contact disappeared. The chemical analysis that proved the connection between the warehouse drugs and the murder victims vanished without a trace. "I don't understand it," Sally had told Marcus, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Everything was here. I checked it myself. It was all here." The internal investigation had been swift and merciless. Who had access to the evidence locker? Who knew the importance of the missing items? Who had motive to protect the inside source? Detective Marcus Rivera, the lead investigator who'd discovered the evidence in the first place. "It doesn't make sense," Marcus had protested to anyone who would listen. "Why would I destroy evidence in my own case?" But the circumstantial evidence was damning. Marcus had been the last person to sign into the evidence locker before the materials went missing. The security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial time period, and most damning of all, a search of Marcus's home had revealed $50,000 in cash hidden in his basement, money he claimed he'd never seen before. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Deputy Chief Hawthorne had said when he delivered the news. but I have to suspend you pending investigation. You know, I don't want to believe this, but the evidence, double quote, the evidence had been overwhelming, too convenient, too perfect, present day, now. Watching Rex's reaction to the Hawthorns, Marcus felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The missing evidence, the planted money, the too convenient timing of everything that had destroyed his life. Your Honor, Sarah Chen was saying, I'd like to call a witness. We're not in the witness phase yet, Counselor, Judge Holloway replied. We're still dealing with opening statements. I understand that, Your Honor, but given the unusual circumstances, I believe Mrs. Margaret Hawthorne might have something to say. The courtroom erupted. Prosecutor Morrison was on her feet, objecting. Deputy Chief Hawthorne was whispering urgently to his wife, and Rex was sitting perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Margaret Hawthorne with the intensity of a laser beam. I didn't know, Margaret whispered, but her voice carried in the sudden silence. I swear I didn't know what he was doing. Maggie, shut up. Hawthorne's facade cracked, revealing something desperate and dangerous beneath. Don't say another word. But Margaret was looking at Rex, and in those amber eyes, she saw something that made her next words inevitable. He made me watch, she said, her voice growing stronger. He made me watch while he burned the evidence. He said it was to protect good cops from bad criminals. But I knew, God help me, I knew it was wrong. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Morrison was shouting objections. The gallery was buzzing with whispers and gasps. Bailiff Rodriguez was trying to maintain order, but through it all, Rex remained perfectly still, his gaze never wavering from Margaret Hawthorne's face. Because he'd done his job. He'd found the crack in the wall of lies. And now the truth was beginning to pour through. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 18 months. Hope. The truth, Marcus realized, was like a dam bursting once. The first crack appeared. Nothing could stop the flood. Margaret, you're making a mistake, Deputy Chief Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in law enforcement. But there was something else in his tone, desperation perhaps, or fear. Rex's ears twitched at the sound. No, William, Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. The mistake was staying quiet for 18 months while an innocent man rotted in jail. Judge Holloway was banging her gavel, trying to restore order to a courtroom that had descended into chaos. Bailiff, clear the gallery. I want everyone except essential personnel out of my courtroom. Now, but before Rodriguez could move, Rex did something that would be talked about in legal circles for years to come. The German Shepherd stood, walked to the center of the courtroom, and lay down directly between Margaret Hawthorne and her husband. It was a protective position, the same stance he'd taken countless times when shielding Marcus from danger. He's protecting her, Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. He knows she's in danger. That's enough, Deputy Chief Hawthorne snapped, rising from his seat. I won't have my family intimidated by this circus. But as he moved toward the center aisle, Rex's head came up, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Not the uncertain whimper from earlier, but the deep, threatening sound of a warrior ready for battle. Hawthorne froze. 30 years I've been a cop, Hawthorne said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. 30 years I've put my life on the line for this city. And now you're going to take the word of a hysterical woman and a trained animal over a decorated officer. I'm going to take the word of truth over the word of a liar, Judge Holloway replied, her voice cold as winter steel. Mrs. Hawthorne, you understand that anything you say can be used against you or your husband in a court of law. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand, and I don't care anymore. I can't carry this weight. Prosecutor Morrison was frantically shuffling through papers, trying to find some legal precedent for what was happening. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Hawthorne isn't under oath. She hasn't been properly sworn in, and she's clearly under duress. The only duress she's under, Sarah Chen interjected, is the weight of her own conscience. Tell us what, Mrs. Hawthorne, Judge Holloway said gently. In your own words. Margaret looked down at Rex, who had turned his magnificent head to meet her gaze. In those amber eyes, she saw something that gave her courage, acceptance, understanding, and the kind of unconditional support that only comes from pure souls. It started 2 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. William came home with more money than he should have had. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, a new car. When I asked him about it, he said he'd been doing consulting work for private security firms. That's enough, Maggie Hawthorne warned. But Rex's growl intensified, and the deputy chief remained frozen in place. I wanted to believe him, Margaret continued. I loved him. I still love him. But then I started finding things. Phone calls, at strange hours, meetings with people who looked like criminals, and the evidence. What evidence? Judge Holloway asked. Files, police files. He'd bring them home sometimes, spread them out on the kitchen table. He said he was working on cases, but I knew better. I'd been married to a cop for 15 years. I knew the difference between official work and something else. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. What kind of files? Drug cases, mostly. Evidence lists, witness statements, and then ... Margaret's voice broke. And then he started burning them. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear dust settling. Even Rex had stopped growling, his amber eyes fixed on Margaret, with the intensity of a confessor listening to a dying man's last words. When Judge Holloway asked, the night before Detective Rivera was arrested, William came home with a box of files, and he burned them in our fireplace. He made me watch. He said I needed to understand that sometimes good cops had to make hard choices to protect the system. What was in those files? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper now. Financial records, phone logs, evidence from the Blue Angel case. The evidence that would have proven Detective Rivera's innocence. The dam burst completely. Deputy Chief Hawthorne lunged toward his wife, his face twisted with rage and desperation. You stupid bitch, you have no idea what you've done. But Rex was faster. The German Shepherd intercepted Hawthorne's charge, 80 pounds of muscle and fury slamming into the corrupt officer and sending him sprawling across the marble floor. Rex stood over him, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling from his chest that promised swift justice for anyone who threatened his protected charge. Get that animal off me, Hawthorne screamed, but his voice had lost all its authority. He was just a man now, exposed and vulnerable, pinned to the floor by a dog who could sense evil with the same precision he'd once used to detect explosives. Rex hold, Marcus commanded, and his partner obeyed instantly, maintaining his position over Hawthorne without allowing his teeth to make contact. Perfect control, perfect discipline, perfect justice. Judge Holloway was on her feet, her gavel. Forgotten bailiff, arrest Deputy Chief Hawthorne, and someone get me the district attorney on the phone. We're going to need to revisit every case this man has touched. As Rodriguez moved to handcuff the fallen officer, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Vindication. But more than that, he felt the pride that comes from being partnered with a being of pure integrity. A soul that couldn't be corrupted or bought or intimidated. Rex looked up at him, tail wagging once, and Marcus saw everything he needed to know in those amber eyes. Justice had been served. But this was only the beginning, as the courtroom erupted in chaos around them. Marcus whispered to his partner, "Good boy, Rex, good boy." The German Shepherd's tail wagged harder, and for the first time in 18 months, Marcus Rivera smiled without reservation. The holding cell beneath the courthouse felt like a confessional, all concrete walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying. Deputy Chief William Hawthorne sat on the metal bench, his hands cuffed behind his back, staring at the floor where his career had shattered like glass against stone. Across from him, in a chair that had been brought down from the courtroom, Margaret Hawthorne wept silently while Detective Sarah Chen took her statement, and in the corner, like a furry statue of justice, Rex lay with his head on his paws, watching everything with those amber eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me about the Blue Angel operation," Chen said, her voice gentler than it had been upstairs. From the beginning. Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue that had already seen too much use. "It started 3 years ago. William came home talking about a new assignment, something about working with federal agents to track drug money. He said it was classified, that he couldn't talk about it. But the extra pay would help us finally buy that house we'd been dreaming about." Marcus stood in the doorway, his shackles removed for the first time in months, listening to the woman whose husband had destroyed his life. He should have felt anger, should have wanted revenge. Instead, he felt something else entirely. Pithy, but it wasn't federal work, was it? Chen prompted. "No." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I figured that out when the first envelope of cash arrived, $20,000, just sitting on our kitchen table when I got home from work. When I asked William about it, he said it was a bonus. But bonuses don't come in unmarked envelopes." Rex's ears twitched at something, a sound in the corridor outside. Footsteps approaching with the measured cadence of authority. A moment later, District Attorney Patricia Williams appeared in the doorway, her face grim with the weight of what she'd learned in the past hour. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Williams said, stepping into the cramped space, "I need you to understand something. Based on what you've told us, we're looking at a conspiracy that goes far beyond your husband. The Blue Angel operation was trafficking drugs through police evidence lockers across 3 states. We're talking about dozens of officers, millions of dollars, and God knows how many innocent people who've been framed or murdered to keep this quiet." Margaret looked up at the DA, her face pale as winter snow. "I never knew it was that big. William never told me." "What did he tell you?" Williams interrupted. "About Detective Rivera specifically." "Why him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Margaret glanced at Rex, who had raised his head at the mention of Marcus's name, and then looked at Marcus himself. "Because Rex wouldn't stop," she said finally. "That dog of yours, he kept finding things. Every raid, every search, every time you two were assigned to a drug case, Rex would alert on evidence that led back to the operation. William said you were getting too close, that Rex's nose was too good." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They framed me because my dog was doing his job." William said Rex was like a bloodhound that couldn't be called off the scent. "He kept leading you to evidence that would have exposed the whole network, so they decided to eliminate both of you from the equation by destroying my reputation and separating us," Marcus said. the pieces finally clicking into place. They knew that even if I figured out I'd been framed, without Rex, I couldn't prove it. Margaret nodded. William said something once, when he'd been drinking. He said the only witness they couldn't buy or intimidate was that damn dog, so they had to make sure no one would believe his handler. Rex stood up, walked over to Marcus, and sat beside him, not the formal sit of a working dog, but the relaxed posture of a friend offering comfort. Marcus's hand found the familiar texture of his partner's fur, and for the first time in 18 months, the world felt like it made sense again. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "The money they planted in your basement, William brought it home first. He showed it to me, said it was evidence in another case, but I saw him counting it, photographing it. He was documenting it before he planted it on you." Dar Williams was taking notes furiously. "Do you know where those photographs are now?" "In his home office, in a file cabinet behind his desk. He keeps records of everything. I think it was insurance, in case the operation ever turned on him." Mrs. Hawthorne Williams said carefully, "Would you be willing to help us search that office? With a warrant, of course." Margaret looked at her husband, slumped on the metal bench like a broken marionette, then back at Marcus and Rex. "Yes," she said. "It's time this ended." But it was Hawthorne himself who spoke next, his voice cracked and bitter. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This operation goes all the way to the top. You think taking me down is going to change anything? They'll just find another fall guy." "Who's they, William?" Dar Williams asked. Hawthorne laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want names? Fine. Captain Rodriguez in narcotics, Lieutenant Morrison in evidence, Detective Patterson in vice. Half the damn department is on the payroll, and the other half is too scared to do anything about it." Marcus felt the room spinning. "Patterson, but he was my partner before Rex." "Yeah, and he's the one who recommended you be transferred to K9 unit," Hawthorne said. "You think that was coincidence? They needed someone clean to front the operation, someone whose reputation was spotless, but they didn't count on that damn dog being so good at his job." Rex's tail wagged at what he clearly interpreted as a compliment, and despite everything, Marcus found himself smiling. His partner had been too honest for a conspiracy built on lies. "There's something else," Margaret said suddenly. "The girl, the one you saved from the warehouse 3 years ago, Maria Santos." Marcus's blood turned to ice. "What about her?" "She didn't overdose by accident," Margaret whispered. "William told me. He told me they couldn't risk her testifying about what she'd seen in that warehouse, about the drugs, about the operation. So they made sure she'd be too strung out to be a credible witness." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus remembered Maria, 13 years old, brave enough to smile at Rex even after everything she'd been through. He remembered visiting her in the hospital, watching her draw pictures of the angel dog who'd saved her. He remembered the call, 6 months later, telling him she'd died of an overdose in a juvenile detention facility. "They killed her," Marcus said, his voice flat and deadly. "They killed a 13-year-old girl to cover their tracks." Rex sensed the change in his partner's emotional state and pressed closer, offering the kind of comfort that only comes from souls who've shared too much pain. But there was something else in the German Shepherd's posture attention that spoke of readiness, of preparation for whatever justice might require. "There's a recording," Margaret said suddenly. "William doesn't know I made it, but there's a recording." Dar Williams looked up sharply. "What kind of recording?" "A phone call. 3 weeks ago. William was talking to someone about Detective Rivera's trial, about making sure the conviction stuck. He mentioned Maria Santos by name, said they couldn't afford to have anyone looking too closely at her death. I recorded it on my phone." Margaret reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a smartphone. "I was going to give it to the FBI, but I was scared. William said if I ever betrayed him, I'd end up like Maria." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft sound of Rex's breathing. D.A. Williams took the phone with hands that trembled slightly, scrolling through the recordings until she found the right file. When William Hawthorne's voice filled the holding cell, clear and unmistakable, admitting to conspiracy, murder, and the systematic corruption of an entire police department, Marcus felt something shift in the universe, a cosmic rebalancing that had been 18 months in the making. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came on 4 legs and wore a badge made of fur and loyalty. The sun was setting over Cleveland when the convoy of FBI vehicles pulled up to the Hawthorne residence in suburban Westlake. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of Agent Jennifer Walsh's black SUV, Rex beside him in the back, both of them watching the house where his life had been destroyed. "You sure you want to be here for this?" Agent Walsh asked. She was a compact, woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, but her voice carried genuine concern. "I need to see it," Marcus replied. "All of it." The search warrant had been expedited through channels that existed for cases involving cop killers and terrorist threats. Within hours of Margaret Hawthorne's confession, federal agents had descended on the Cleveland Police Department like locusts, seizing computers, files, and evidence lockers that hadn't been opened in months. But it was the Hawthorne house that held the smoking gun, the photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that would bring down not just William Hawthorne but an entire network of corruption that stretched across 3 states and involved more than 40 officers. Rex whined softly as they approached the front door, his nose working the air with the intensity of a sommelier detecting poison in fine wine. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked. The German Shepherd's hackles rose, and he looked toward the house with the same expression he'd worn in that courtroom: recognition, anger, and something else. Something that made Marcus's hand instinctively move toward the service weapon Agent Walsh had reluctantly allowed him to carry. "There's someone in there," Marcus said. "Someone who shouldn't be." Agent Walsh's hand went to her radio. "All units, possible compromised entry. Approach with caution." But before she could finish the transmission, the front door of the Hawthorne house exploded outward in a shower of wood and glass. The figure that emerged wasn't William Hawthorne. He was still in federal custody downtown. It was Detective Ray Patterson, Marcus's former partner, the man who'd recommended him for the K9 unit, and he was carrying a gasoline can and a lighter. "Patterson," Agent Walsh shouted, "federal agents, drop your weapons and get on the ground." But Patterson wasn't listening. His eyes were wild with desperation, his movements erratic with the kind of panic that comes when a man realizes his world is ending. "It's too late," he screamed. "It's all too late." He splashed gasoline across the front porch, the acrid smell cutting through the evening air like a knife. "You think you can destroy us all? You think that dog and his Boy Scout handler can bring down something this big?" Rex was straining against his leash, every muscle in his body coiled for action. Marcus had seen this before: his partner detecting an imminent threat, preparing to neutralize danger before it could harm innocent people. "Ray," Marcus called, stepping out from behind the SUV. "Don't do this. It's over. Just let it be over." Patterson's head snapped toward the sound of Marcus's voice, and when he saw his former partner, something broke behind his eyes. "Marcus fucking Rivera," he snarled, "the golden boy, the straight arrow. Do you have any idea how much money you cost us? How many operations you and that damn dog ruined? Enough to kill a 13-year-old girl?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying across the suburban street like a judgment from heaven. Patterson's face went pale. "Maria Santos was collateral damage. She was dying anyway. We just sped up the process." It was the wrong thing to say in front of a man whose partner could sense evil with the precision of a tuning fork. Rex's growl filled the evening air, low and threatening, the sound of justice preparing to strike. "Let me guess," Marcus continued, taking a step closer. "The evidence in that house proves everything: financial records, photographs, recordings, everything Margaret Hawthorne said and more." "That bitch," Patterson spat. "She was supposed to keep her mouth shut. Hawthorne promised he could control her." "You can't control truth, Ray, and you can't intimidate a dog who's seen real evil." Patterson raised the lighter, his thumb hovering over the ignition. "Maybe not, but I can make sure none of that evidence ever sees the inside of a courtroom. Fire in the hole." Agent Walsh shouted, and her team scattered for cover. But Marcus didn't move. Neither did Rex, because they'd been in situations like this before: moments when innocent lives hung in the balance, when split-second decisions meant the difference between justice and catastrophe. "Rex," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying 8 years of absolute trust, "take him down." The German Shepherd exploded into motion like a missile launched from a divine silo. 80 pounds of muscle, bone, and righteous fury covered the distance between threat and justice in 3 bounds. Patterson had time to flick the lighter, had time to see the flame catch, but no time to drop it before Rex hit him like a freight train made of fur and fangs. The lighter flew from Patterson's hand, spinning through the air in a perfect arc that would have ignited the gasoline-soaked porch and destroyed years of evidence. Would have, if not for Agent Walsh's reflexes and a fire extinguisher that turned potential catastrophe into nothing more than the smell of chemical foam and defeated corruption. Rex held Patterson pinned to the ground with the same gentle precision he'd used on William Hawthorne and forced to prevent escape, not enough to cause serious injury. Perfect control from a perfect partner. "Good boy," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with 8 years of accumulated pride. "Good boy, Rex." "Boy, Rex." As the FBI agents swarmed the scene, securing Patterson and beginning the careful process of documenting evidence that would put dozens of corrupt cops behind bars, Marcus knelt beside his partner and buried his face in the familiar warmth of Rex's fur. "We did it, boy," he whispered. "We finally did it." Rex's tail wagged once, not the excited wag of a pet, but the controlled acknowledgement of a warrior who'd completed his mission. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the innocent had been protected. It was what they'd trained for, what they'd lived for, what they'd been born for. The Cleveland Plain Dealer's headline the next morning read, "Hero Dog Exposes Police Corruption. Scandal Wrongfully Imprisoned Officer Vindicated by K9 Partners Courtroom Drama." But it was the photograph that made the story unforgettable. Rex sitting beside Marcus on the courthouse steps, both of them silhouetted against the morning sun. The German Shepherd's tongue lolling out in what could only be described as a satisfied grin. Inside the courthouse, the machinery of justice was working overtime. Federal prosecutors had unsealed indictments against 43 current and former Cleveland police officers. The Blue Angel drug operation had been shut down, its assets seized, its leaders awaiting trial, and at the center of it all, a German shepherd who'd refused to let lies stand unchallenged. The dog knew. Margaret Hawthorne told reporter Amanda Sykes in an exclusive interview. Somehow, some way, that beautiful animal knew what my husband had done, and he wouldn't let it stand. The interviewer, broadcast on every major network, showed Margaret sitting in her living room, the same room where William Hawthorne had burned evidence and planned the destruction of an innocent man's life. Rex lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap, offering the kind of comfort that transcends species. People ask me how a dog could know about corruption, about lies, about injustice. Margaret continued, her hand gently stroking Rex's fur. But anyone who's ever loved a dog knows the answer. They don't see politics or procedures or legal technicalities. They see good and evil. They see truth and lies. And they never, ever compromise. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The Cleveland Police Department's phone lines were jammed with calls from citizens demanding reform. City Council called emergency sessions. The mayor announced a complete overhaul of police oversight, procedures. But it was the smaller gestures that meant the most to Marcus. A package arrived at his apartment, his first apartment as a free man in 18 months, containing a hand-drawn picture. It showed a girl and a German shepherd, both wearing halos, floating among clouds. The note attached was written in careful, childish handwriting. Dear Detective Rivera and Rex, my name is Sofia Santos. Maria was my big sister. Thank you for getting the bad men who hurt her. She told me about the angel dog who saved her. Now I know he saved you too. Love, Sophia, age 9. Marcus read the note 3 times before his vision blurred too much to continue. Rex, sensing his partner's emotional state, pressed closer and placed his head on Marcus's lap, the same gesture of comfort he'd offered to Maria Santos in that warehouse 3 years ago. The criminal trials would take months, maybe years. The civil lawsuits would drag on even longer. The Cleveland Police Department would undergo a complete reorganization, with federal oversight and new training protocols designed to prevent the kind of systemic corruption that had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. But for Marcus Rivera and Rex, the victory was simpler and more profound. They were partners again. They were home. The doorbell rang, interrupting Marcus's thoughts. He opened it to find a small delegation from the neighborhood, families with children, elderly couples, young professionals who'd followed the story on social media. They stood on his porch holding casseroles, flowers, and welcome home signs. "We just wanted to say thank you," said Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, "for showing us what real heroes look like." Her granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 8, stepped forward shyly. "Can I pet your dog?" she asked. Marcus looked down at Rex, who was already in his gentle mode, the patient, calm demeanor he adopted around children. "What do you think, boy? You up for some fan attention?" Rex's tail wagged and he settled into a perfect sit, allowing the little girl to run her hands through his fur. Within minutes, a dozen children had gathered around the German shepherd, all of them drawn to the dog who'd become a symbol of justice, loyalty, and the kind of courage that couldn't be corrupted. "He's so soft," one child marveled. "He's so big," whispered another. "He's so good," said the little girl who'd asked to pet him first. Yes, Marcus thought, watching his partner accept the children's attention with the patience of a saint. He is good. In a world full of corruption and compromise, Rex had remained pure, a living reminder that some things couldn't be bought, intimidated, or destroyed. The crowd eventually dispersed, leaving Marcus and Rex alone on their porch as the sun set over Cleveland. But they weren't really alone. They had each other, and after 18 months of separation, that was everything. 6 months later, the canine training facility in suburban Akron buzzed with activity as a new class of police dogs and their handlers to work through their paces. Marcus stood at the edge of the training field, watching young officers learn the fundamentals of partnership with their 4-legged teammates. Rex lay beside him in the shade, his muzzle now touched with gray, his movements a little slower than they'd been in his prime. 8 years of police work, 3 tours in Iraq, and 18 months of waiting had taken their toll. But his amber eyes were as sharp as ever, missing nothing, judging everything. "You thinking about retirement?" asked Captain Jennifer Walsh, for Agent Walsh, now heading up the Cleveland Police Department's reformed K9 unit as part of the federal oversight agreement. Marcus smiled, his hand finding the familiar comfort of Rex's fur. "Every day. But then I watch these kids learning to trust their partners, and I think maybe we've got a few more lessons to teach. The department would understand if you wanted to step back. After everything you've been through, after everything we've been through," Marcus corrected gently. "I think we've earned the right to help make sure it never happens again." Rex's tail thumped against the ground, not the sharp wag of excitement, but the slow, satisfied rhythm of contentment. They'd found their place in the world again, and it felt right. A young officer approached, leading a German shepherd puppy that couldn't have been more than 6 months old. "Detective Rivera, I'm Officer Martinez. This is Bruno. I was wondering if you could give us some pointers." Marcus studied the puppy, all paws and ears and boundless enthusiasm, and saw Rex 8 years ago. young and eager and ready to take on the world. "What's the most important thing you've learned so far?" he asked Martinez. The young officer thought for a moment. That he's not just a tool, he's a partner. Good, what else? That trust goes both ways. He has to trust me, but I have to trust him too, even when I don't understand what he's trying to tell me. Rex lifted his head, studying the puppy with the patient expression of a veteran watching a recruit. Bruno, sensing the older dog's attention, bounded over and began the elaborate ritual of canine greeting, tail wagging, play bowing, checking all the important scent signatures that dogs use to introduce themselves. "He likes you," Martinez said, watching his puppy interact with the legendary Rex. "Rex likes everyone," Marcus replied, "but he loves very few. The difference is important." They watched the dogs interact for a few minutes, Bruno's youthful exuberance gradually calming under Rex's steady influence. It was like watching a masterclass in partnership, the older dog teaching through example, showing the younger one how to balance energy with discipline, enthusiasm with restraint. "There's something else," Martinez said hesitantly. "Something I wanted to ask you about the trial. How did you know Rex was trying to tell you something important? How did you know to trust him when everyone else thought he was just being disruptive?" Marcus considered the question, watching Rex demonstrate the proper way to sit for Bruno's benefit. "Because I'd learned to listen," he said finally. "Not just to his barks or his whines, but to everything. His body language, his breathing, the way he held his head. After 8 years together, we didn't need words. But in court, when he was acting strange, how did you know it meant something?" Because Rex had never acted strange before. In 8 years of partnership, through war zones and drug raids and bomb threats, he'd never shown fear or uncertainty. So when he did, I knew it was important. I just had to trust him long enough to figure out what he was trying to tell me. Rex stood up, walked over to Bruno, and gently placed his paw on the puppy's head, a gesture of blessing, of welcome, of passing the torch to the next generation. Bruno settled immediately, instinctively recognizing the authority and wisdom of his elder. "That's what partnership looks like," Marcus told Martinez. "Trust, respect, and the understanding that your dog might know things you don't. Your job isn't to control him, it's to listen to him." As the afternoon wore on, more handlers approached. Drawn by the opportunity to learn from the team that had become legendary in law enforcement circles, Marcus and Rex fielded questions, demonstrated techniques, and shared the kind of wisdom that only comes from years of absolute partnership. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most, moments when Rex would catch Marcus's eye and something would pass between them, an understanding that transcended words. They'd been through hell together, had their lives destroyed and rebuilt, had seen the worst of humanity and somehow emerged with their faith intact. As the sun began to set, Marcus made a decision that had been building for months. "What do you say, old friend?" he asked Rex, ready to go home. Rex's tail wagged out, the excited wag of anticipation, but the slow, contented rhythm of a job well done. They walked to Marcus's truck, Rex moving with the careful dignity of a veteran who'd earned his rest. But instead of heading back to the apartment they'd shared since Marcus's release, Marcus turned toward a different destination, a small house in the suburbs with a fenced yard and a porch perfect for watching sunsets. The sold sign in the front yard had been there for a week, but this was their first time seeing their new home together. Marcus had bought it with part of the settlement from his wrongful imprisonment lawsuit money. That felt clean because it came from justice, not corruption. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked as they stood in the driveway. "Think we can be happy here?" Rex walked a slow circle around the yard, his nose working the air, cataloging scents and possibilities. When he returned to Marcus's side, his tail was wagging with something approaching enthusiasm. They sat on the front porch as darkness fell over their new neighborhood, Rex's head resting on Marcus's lap, both of them watching stars appear in the clear Ohio sky. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, and Marcus found himself thinking about Maria Santos, about Sophia's drawing, about the price of justice and the value of truth. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" he whispered into Rex's fur. "We did the right thing." Rex's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a single, definitive acknowledgement that spoke volumes about duty, honor, and the bonds that hold good souls. Together they sat in comfortable silence as the night settled around them, two warriors at rest, their battles won, their consciences clear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to serve justice and protect the innocent. But tonight, they were just a man and his dog, sitting on their own porch, watching the stars come out over a world that was, perhaps, a little bit better because they'd refused to let lies stand. Unchallenged. 1 year later. The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, with golden leaves falling like confetti around the memorial garden behind Cleveland Police Headquarters. Rex had passed peacefully in his sleep 3 days earlier, his graying muzzle resting on Marcus's lap, his amber eyes closing for the last time with the contentment of a soul that had fulfilled its purpose. The turnout was extraordinary. Officers from 6 states, federal agents who'd worked the corruption case, families whose lives had been touched by Rex's service, children who'd met him at community events, Even Sophia Santos, now 10 years old, holding a wreath made of blue and white flowers, the colors of justice and purity. Police Chief Williams Jennifer Walsh had been promoted after the federal oversight ended, spoke about service and sacrifice, about the bond between officers and their canine partners, about the difference one good dog could make in a world that sometimes forgot the meaning of loyalty. But it was Marcus who delivered the eulogy that left no dry eyes in the crowd. "Rex taught me that truth isn't complicated," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. "It doesn't require evidence or witnesses or legal procedures. Truth just is. And if you're brave enough, honest enough, loyal enough to stand with truth, it will never abandon you." He paused, looking down at the bronze plaque that would mark Rex's final resting place, REX K-9 Unit, Cleveland Police Department 2016-2024. "He never stopped believing in justice. People ask me what made Rex special," Marcus continued. "They want to know how a dog could expose corruption, could see through lies, could know right from wrong with such clarity. The answer is simple. Rex never learned to compromise. He never learned that sometimes good enough is good enough, that sometimes you have to look the other way, that sometimes justice is too expensive or too difficult or too dangerous to pursue." The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the memorial garden, and for a moment Marcus could swear he heard the ghost of a familiar bark carried on the autumn air. 8 years ago, Rex saved my life in a warehouse full of drug dealers. 18 months ago, he saved my soul in a courtroom full of lies. But the truth is, he saved me every single day we were together. Just by being exactly what he was, incorruptible, loyal and brave enough to do what was right even when it was hard. Marcus knelt and placed his hand on the bronze plaque, feeling the warmth of metal that would soon grow cold with winter's approach. But Rex's legacy would never grow cold. It would live on in every canine unit that refused to be silenced, every officer who chose truth over convenience, every soul brave enough to stand with justice even when standing alone. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Sophia Santos approached Marcus with shy steps and eyes bright with unshed tears. "Detective Rivera," she said quietly, "I wanted to give you something." She handed him a folded piece of paper, another drawing, this one showing Rex with full wings, wearing a halo that sparkled with silver crayon, running through clouds toward a small figure with long dark hair. "That's Maria," Sophia explained. "She's been waiting for him." Marcus's vision blurred as he looked at the drawing, seeing not just a child's imagination but a profound truth about souls that touch each other across the boundaries of species, time, and death. "Thank you," he whispered. She would have loved this. As Sophia walked away with her family, Marcus stood alone in the memorial garden, autumn wind stirring the leaves around his feet. Somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of young officers training with their canine partners, the next generation learning the lessons that Rex had taught through 8 years of perfect service. The bronze plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun, but it was the words beneath Rex's name that would be remembered. Long after the metal tarnished and the garden changed with the seasons, he never stopped believing in justice, and in a world that sometimes forgot the difference between right and wrong, between truth and convenience, between loyalty and compromise, that belief pure, unwavering, and incorruptible as the amber eyes that had once gazed upon it would be Rex's greatest gift to those who came after. The wind picked up again, and Marcus could swear he heard it. One last bark carried on the autumn air, the sound of a good dog saying goodbye to a partner who'd learned to listen, to trust, and to believe that sometimes justice comes on for legs and wears a badge made of fur and love. He never barked again, not because he couldn't, but because he had already spoken the truth that would echo through every courtroom, every precinct, every heart brave enough to hear it. That loyalty is not just a word, justice is not just a concept, and love is not just an emotion, but the very foundation upon which all good souls stand when darkness threatens to overwhelm the light. Rex had taught them all to listen. Now it was up to them to remember what they'd heard. In memory of all canine officers who serve with courage, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Their legacy lives on in every life they save, every truth they reveal, and every heart they touch with their boundless capacity for love and devotion to duty.